He'd been flying the same Messerschmitt for 2 years, patching bullet holes with spare parts scavenged from crashed planes. Then he saw American pilots abandon aircraft after minor damage. What happened next made him realize Germany had already lost the war. January 1945, a German fighter base in Bavaria. Hauptmann Captain Franz Stigler is one of the Luftwaffe's surviving aces with over 400 combat missions. He's nursing a damaged Bf-109 that should have been scrapped months ago. Then American bombers hit his airfield and he's captured. During interrogation, an American officer casually mentions that damaged aircraft are often just pushed off carrier decks into the ocean. Stigler thinks it's a joke. It's not. This is the story of what a veteran German pilot learned about American aviation that made him understand why the Luftwaffe never stood a chance. Franz Stigler was born in 1915 in Regensburg, Germany. He grew up during the chaos after World War I. Hyperinflation, political instability, national humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles. Like many young Germans of his generation, Stigler was attracted to organizations promising to restore German greatness. He joined the Hitler Youth as a teenager, not because he was particularly political, but because it offered structure and purpose. Stigler's real passion was flying. He was fascinated by aircraft from childhood. He'd watch planes fly over and dream of being a pilot. In 1935, when Germany started openly rebuilding its air force in violation of the Versailles Treaty, Stigler applied for pilot training. He was accepted into the Luftwaffe and began training in 1936. The training was rigorous. Germany was building an air force from scratch and needed pilots quickly, but they also needed quality. Stigler excelled. He had natural aptitude for flying and good spatial awareness. By 1939, when the war started, Stigler was a qualified fighter pilot flying the Bf-109, Germany's frontline fighter. Stigler flew combat missions in the early campaigns, Poland, France, the Battle of Britain. He survived when many of his comrades didn't. By 1943, Stigler was an experienced ace with multiple confirmed kills. He'd been shot down twice and wounded once, but he always came back. The Luftwaffe needed experienced pilots desperately as losses mounted. But by 1944, Stigler's experience was teaching him uncomfortable truths. The Luftwaffe was losing, not just battles, but the entire air war. Allied air superiority was overwhelming. German pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Aircraft production couldn't keep up with losses. Fuel shortages meant less training for new pilots and fewer missions for veterans. Everything was getting worse. Stigler's personal experience illustrated the problem. He'd been flying the same Bf-109 for over 2 years. The aircraft had been damaged multiple times, bullet holes patched, engine replaced once, canopy cracked and repaired with improvised materials, control surfaces damaged and rebuilt. The plane should have been retired months ago, but replacement aircraft weren't available. So mechanics kept patching and repairing and hoping the plane would hold together for one more mission. This wasn't just Stigler's experience. It was typical across the Luftwaffe. By late 1944, pilots flew aircraft that were barely airworthy because there weren't replacements. Missions were flown on minimal fuel because fuel was scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Spare parts were scavenged from crashed aircraft. The entire Luftwaffe was held together with improvisation and desperation. Meanwhile, Stigler watched Allied air formations grow larger and more frequent. American daylight bomber raids involved hundreds of bombers escorted by hundreds of fighters. British night raids were equally massive. The Allies could afford to lose dozens of aircraft per raid and still come back the next day with full strength. Germany would lose a few planes, and those losses were permanent. Replacements weren't coming. Stigler understood the mathematics. Germany was in a death spiral. Each loss weakened the Luftwaffe. Each replacement pilot had less training and experience. Each mission became more dangerous as Allied air superiority increased. Eventually, the Luftwaffe would be unable to mount any effective resistance. It was just a matter of time. By January 1945, Stigler's unit was based in Bavaria, defending against American bomber raids targeting German industry and oil facilities. The missions were suicide runs. The Americans had complete air superiority. German fighters that managed to take off faced overwhelming numbers of American escorts. Most German pilots didn't survive their first few missions. Stigler survived because of experience and luck, but he knew his luck would run out eventually. On January 14, 1945, Stigler's airfield was hit by an American bombing raid. He was on the ground when the bombs fell. He survived by diving into a shelter, but his aircraft was destroyed. The entire airfield was wrecked, hangars demolished, fuel depots burning, most of the aircraft destroyed. The surviving pilots and ground crew were scattered. Stigler and several other pilots tried to escape on foot, but American forces advancing into Bavaria captured them within days. Stigler expected harsh treatment. German propaganda had portrayed Americans as brutal enemies who tortured and executed captured pilots. Stigler was nervous but resigned. The war was over for him. All he could do was try to survive whatever came next. Instead of torture, Stigler received food, medical care, and was transporting to an interrogation center. The interrogation was professional. American intelligence officers asked about his unit, his aircraft, German tactics, and current Luftwaffe capabilities. Stigler gave minimal information beyond name, rank, and serial number. The interrogators didn't push hard. They seemed more interested in his general impressions than in specific intelligence. During one interrogation session, the American officer mentioned something casually that shocked Stigler. The officer said that American aircraft carriers sometimes push damaged aircraft off the deck into the ocean to make room for incoming planes. Just push them overboard. Perfectly repairable aircraft discarded like garbage because it was faster than moving them below deck. Stigler thought this was a joke or propaganda. No Air Force would waste aircraft like that. Aircraft were valuable. You repaired them. You salvaged parts. You didn't just throw them away. The American officer saw Stigler's skepticism and smiled. He said it was true. America produced so many aircraft that individual planes weren't precious. Time was more valuable than metal. If pushing a damaged plane overboard saved time, they pushed it overboard. Stigler didn't believe it, or didn't want to believe it, but over the following weeks, as Stigler was processed through POW camps and eventually transporting to America, he learned more about American aviation that challenged everything he thought he knew. Stigler was sent to a POW camp in Arizona. The camp was in the desert, isolated from major population centers. The conditions were basic but adequate: barracks, mess hall, exercise areas, medical clinic. Stigler and thousands of other Luftwaffe prisoners settled into the routine of camp life, work details, recreation, waiting for the war to end. But Stigler's curiosity about what the American interrogator had said wouldn't let go. Had it really been true? Did Americans throw away aircraft? It seemed impossible, but Stigler started asking questions, talking to guards, reading newspapers that were sometimes made available to prisoners, piecing together information about American aviation. What Stigler learned shocked him. American aircraft production was on a scale he could barely comprehend. Germany was producing a few hundred aircraft per month by late 1944. America was producing thousands per month, not just total across all types, thousands of individual models, over 3,000 B-24 bombers per month at peak production, over 2,000 P-51 fighters per month, numbers that seemed impossible. But the numbers were real. Stigler learned that American factories used assembly line methods similar to automobile production. Aircraft rolled off production lines in continuous streams. The Willow Run plant in Michigan produced a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak efficiency, one bomber per hour. The concept was staggering to Stigler. German aircraft production was artisanal by comparison. Skilled workers assembled aircraft carefully with tight tolerances. Production was measured in dozens per month, not thousands. Germany's approach produced excellent individual aircraft, but couldn't match American production volume. Stigler had known American production was higher, but he hadn't understood the scale of the gap. This production disparity explained the disposable attitude toward damaged aircraft. If you're producing thousands of planes per month, losing one damaged plane doesn't matter. The replacement is already built and probably already on a ship heading to the combat zone. It's more efficient to push the damaged plane overboard and land the incoming plane than to spend time moving the damaged plane below deck for repairs that might take days or weeks. For German pilots like Stigler, who'd flown aircraft that had been patched and repaired countless times. This disposable attitude was alien. German pilots formed attachments to their aircraft. They'd name them, decorate them, fly the same plane for years if it survived. American pilots flew whatever aircraft was assigned. If it got damaged, they'd get a new one. Aircraft were interchangeable tools, not individual machines to be cherished. Stigler learned about other American aviation practices that shocked him. American pilot training was thorough and took time. New pilots received hundreds of hours of training before entering combat. They flew multiple types of aircraft during training. They practiced formation flying, gunnery, navigation, and emergency procedures until they were competent. Only then were they sent to combat units. German pilot training by 1944 had collapsed. New pilots received minimal training due to fuel shortages and lack of training aircraft. Some pilots were sent to combat units with barely 100 hours total flight time. They were thrown into combat against experienced Allied pilots and usually died quickly. Germany was burning through pilots faster than they could train replacements, even with shortened training. The difference in training showed in combat effectiveness. American pilots arriving at combat units in 1944 were well prepared. They could execute complex tactics. They worked well in formations. They could handle emergencies. German pilots arriving at combat units in 1944 were barely competent to fly their aircraft, let alone fight in it. They were target practice for Allied pilots. Stigler also learned about American aircraft design philosophy. American aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and Thunderbolt weren't necessarily superior to German aircraft like the Bf-109 or FW-190 in every performance metric. But American aircraft were designed for reliability and ease of maintenance. They could operate from rough airfields. They could be serviced by mechanics with basic training. They were built with generous tolerances that made them forgiving to fly and easy to repair. German aircraft were engineering marvels, but often temperamental. High-performance engines required careful maintenance. Complex systems had many potential failure points. Training mechanics took time that Germany didn't have. Operating from damaged airfields was difficult. German aircraft achieved higher performance, but at the cost of reliability and maintainability. In war, reliability matters more than peak performance. A slightly slower aircraft that's always available is more valuable than a faster aircraft that's frequently broken. American aircraft could maintain high operational readiness rates because they were designed for it. German aircraft had lower operational readiness because complexity made maintenance difficult, especially when spare parts were scarce. Stigler learned about American aircraft carriers and naval aviation. Germany had never successfully developed a carrier force. The Luftwaffe and German Navy had fought over who would control naval aviation, and the result was that Germany had essentially no carrier capability. America had dozens of carriers by 1945. Large fleet carriers that could each carry nearly 100 aircraft. Smaller escort carriers for submarine hunting and support roles. The scale of American naval aviation shocked Stigler. American carriers operated in the Pacific with more aircraft than Germany's entire remaining fighter force. Individual carrier air groups had dozens of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. Multiple carriers operating together could launch airstrikes with hundreds of aircraft. The logistics of supporting these operations was staggering. Stigler learned that American carrier operations were so routine that damaged aircraft really were pushed overboard to maintain flight deck efficiency. The story the interrogator had told wasn't propaganda. It was standard procedure. If a damaged aircraft couldn't be quickly moved below deck, it was pushed over the side. New aircraft would be brought up from the hangar deck. The carrier's operational tempo was maintained at the cost of individual aircraft. This was possible only because America had so many aircraft that individual losses didn't matter. This revelation made Stigler understand something fundamental about the war. Germany had been playing a different game than America. Germany tried to win through tactical excellence and technological superiority. America won through overwhelming material superiority. German pilots were often more skilled. German aircraft often had better performance, but America had 10 times as many pilots and 100 times as many aircraft. Numbers overwhelmed quality. Stigler started talking to other Luftwaffe prisoners about what he was learning. Some refused to believe it. They insisted American production numbers were propaganda, that America was lying about their capabilities to demoralize German prisoners. These prisoners clung to the belief that German technology and fighting spirit would prevail somehow. Stigler knew better. He'd seen Allied air armadas over Germany. He knew the numbers were real. Other Luftwaffe prisoners were more receptive. They'd seen the same things Stigler had. They'd watched the Luftwaffe shrink while Allied air power grew. They understood that Germany had lost the air war completely. These prisoners wanted to understand why. What had Germany done wrong? How had they been so badly miscalculated? Stigler explained what he was learning, that the war had been decided by industrial capacity, not tactical skill, that Germany couldn't build aircraft fast enough to replace losses while America built aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them, that German pilot training had collapsed while American training remained robust, that every advantage Germany had at the start of the war had been eroded by attrition and overwhelmed by American production. The conversations in the POW camp weren't about tactics or battles. They were about understanding how Germany had lost, how the Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies early in the war, had been reduced to irrelevance by 1945. The answer was uncomfortable but clear. Germany had been outproduced. American industrial power had buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of aircraft, pilots, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. In May 1945, news reached the POW camp that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Some Luftwaffe prisoners were relieved. The fighting was done. They'd survived. Others were depressed. Germany had lost. Everything they'd fought for was gone. Stigler felt mostly empty. He'd known the war was lost for months. The official surrender just confirmed it. But something happened in the POW camp after the surrender that crystallized everything for Stigler. An American officer visited the camp to give a presentation to German prisoners. The presentation was about American war production. It included photographs and film footage of American factories, aircraft factories, tank factories, shipyards. The scale was overwhelming. One sequence showed the Willow Run bomber plant, the massive building, the assembly line stretching the length of the facility, B-24 bombers in various stages of assembly. The final sequence showed completed bombers rolling out of the factory and taking off from the adjacent airfield, one after another. The footage was sped up to show a day's production, dozens of bombers, all from one factory, all in one day. Stigler watched this footage and felt something break inside him. He'd spent years fighting with everything he had, risking his life on every mission, flying aircraft that should have been retired, watching friends die, and for what? Germany had been fighting an enemy who produced aircraft like automobiles by the dozens per day from single factories. The Luftwaffe had never had a chance. After the presentation, Stigler approached the American officer. He asked if the footage was real, if American production had really been that high. The officer confirmed it was real. Those were actual factories producing actual aircraft at those rates. Stigler asked why Americans had shown this to German prisoners. What was the purpose? The officer explained that American leadership wanted German prisoners to understand why Germany had lost, not because German soldiers weren't brave or skilled, not because German equipment was inferior in quality, but because the economic and industrial disparity was too large. Germany couldn't win a war of attrition against enemies with vastly superior production capacity. Understanding this would help German prisoners accept the defeat and prepare to rebuild Germany on different principles. Stigler understood. The lesson was clear. Germany had gambled everything on quick victories and technological advantages. When the war became a long attrition fight, Germany's limited industrial base couldn't sustain the effort. America's massive industrial base could produce essentially unlimited war material. The outcome was inevitable once the war became about production rather than tactical brilliance. This understanding changed how Stigler thought about his war service. He'd been proud of his achievements as a pilot, his survival, his skills, but now he saw it differently. Individual heroism didn't matter when the system was rigged against you. German pilots could be the best in the world, and it wouldn't change the outcome if the enemy had 10 times as many planes. Stigler spent the rest of 1945 in the Arizona POW camp. He worked, he read, he learned English. He prepared mentally for returning to Germany. He knew what he'd find there: destruction, occupation, poverty. Germany would have to rebuild from ruins. The question was what kind of Germany would emerge from the ashes. In early 1946, Stigler was repatriated to Germany. The journey by ship and train took weeks. When he finally arrived in Bavaria, the devastation was worse than he'd imagined. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, people homeless and hungry. This was the result of the war Germany had started, the war Stigler had fought in, the war that had been doomed from the start due to economic realities that German leadership had either ignored or not understood. Stigler never flew again. The idea of flying had been tainted by the war. He'd loved aviation as a young man, but after seeing what air power had done to Germany, after understanding the waste and futility of the Luftwaffe's final battles, Stigler had no desire to return to the cockpit. He found work in reconstruction, helping rebuild the infrastructure that Allied bombing had destroyed, physical labor that helped him not think about the war. Franz Stigler's journey from confident Luftwaffe ace to disillusioned POW who understood Germany's defeat reveals important truths about World War II air warfare and about military power in general. The Luftwaffe didn't lose because German pilots were cowardly or because German aircraft were inferior. Individual German pilots were often more experienced and skilled than their Allied counterparts, especially early in the war. German aircraft like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 were excellent fighters. The Luftwaffe lost because Germany couldn't produce aircraft, train pilots, and sustain operations at the scale required to compete with Allied air power. America alone produced over 300 aircraft during World War II. Germany produced about 120,000. When you add British and Soviet production, the gap becomes overwhelming. Germany was outnumbered in the air by ratios that made victory impossible. This production disparity had cascading effects. German pilots flew more missions because there were fewer of them. This increased fatigue and casualties. Replacement pilots received less training because fuel was scarce. Less trained pilots died faster. The quality of the Luftwaffe pilot corps declined over time, while Allied pilot training remained robust. By 1945, Germany was sending barely trained teenagers into combat against veteran Allied pilots in superior numbers. The disposable attitude toward damaged aircraft that shocked Stigler was a symptom of American abundance. America could afford to treat aircraft as expendable because they were being produced faster than they could be lost. Germany couldn't afford to discard any aircraft because replacements weren't coming. This forced German mechanics to repair aircraft that should have been scrapped, which reduced operational readiness and safety. German aircraft design philosophy emphasized performance over reliability because Germany was trying to overcome numerical inferiority through technological superiority. If German aircraft were 10% better, maybe German pilots could defeat enemies that outnumbered them 2-1. But this approach failed because the numerical disparity grew to 10-1 and then 20-1. No amount of technological superiority could overcome that gap. American aircraft design philosophy emphasized reliability and ease of production because America understood that winning through attrition required sustainable production. Slightly inferior aircraft that could be produced in vast numbers and maintained easily were more valuable than superior aircraft that were complex and scarce. This philosophy proved correct. American aircraft losses were replaced faster than they occurred. German aircraft losses were permanent. The psychological impact on German pilots of realizing they were fighting an unwinnable war was significant. Stigler and pilots like him had risked their lives repeatedly for a cause that was doomed from the start. This realization bred resentment toward German leadership that had started a war Germany couldn't win. Some pilots remained proud of their service and skills. Others, like Stigler, became disillusioned and angry about the waste. For Allied planners, the air war strategy of overwhelming German defenses through numerical superiority worked. It was costly. Allied air forces lost tens of thousands of aircraft and aircrew, but the losses were sustainable because production exceeded losses. Germany's losses weren't sustainable. Every loss weakened the Luftwaffe. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, not because individual German pilots gave up, but because there weren't enough pilots or aircraft left to contest Allied air superiority. The lesson Stigler learned about industrial capacity determining military outcomes wasn't new. World War I had shown that industrial nations could sustain longer wars than agricultural nations, but World War II demonstrated it on an unprecedented scale. America's industrial capacity was so vast that it could fight wars on two fronts simultaneously while maintaining domestic prosperity. Germany couldn't even sustain one front without civilian sacrifices that eventually led to collapse. Stigler's post-war life reflected his understanding of these lessons. He never glorified his war service. He never joined veteran organizations that celebrated Luftwaffe achievements. He recognized that the Luftwaffe had fought bravely, but for a lost cause. He focused on helping rebuild Germany as a peaceful, democratic nation that would never again make the mistake of thinking military conquest could overcome economic disadvantages. The story of pushing damaged aircraft off carrier decks, which seemed like wasteful absurdity to Stigler initially, was actually the purest expression of American military philosophy in World War II. America won by building so much that individual losses didn't matter. This approach worked because America had the industrial capacity to implement it. Germany tried to win through efficiency and quality because they couldn't match Allied quantity. It didn't work. Modern air forces still struggle with this tension between quality and quantity. Advanced fighter aircraft like the F-22 or F-35 are vastly superior to older designs, but they're expensive and produced in limited numbers. Some military theorists argue for larger numbers of less capable aircraft. Others argue for smaller numbers of superior aircraft. The debate continues. But World War II demonstrated clearly that in a total war between industrial nations, quantity is its own quality. Having enough aircraft to dominate the skies matters more than having the best aircraft. Franz Stigler died in 2008 at age 92. In his later years, he occasionally spoke about his war experiences, always with the caveat that young Germans should learn from the war that military solutions to political problems fail when economic realities don't support them. Germany had been powerful in 1939, but not powerful enough to defeat the combined industrial might of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States. German leadership had gambled that the war would be quick. When it became long, Germany's defeat was inevitable. That was the lesson Stigler wanted future generations to understand. Don't start wars you can't win, and you can't win wars against enemies who can outproduce you 10 to 1.